Hey, happy President's Day, or happy not my President's Day, if you're one of the rampaging snowflakes out in the streets. Speaking of the president, or the not my president, President Tweet, that's what we should call him. President Trump tweeted the other day, the fake news media, failing New York Times, NBC News, ABC, CBS, CNN is not my enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. And the press went bananas. Oh, this is unprecedented. He's identifying the media as the enemy of the American people. A lot of other people went bananas too. John McCain said, suppressing the media, this was the first step toward a dictatorship. McCain, incidentally, got clobbered by the media in the final stages of the 2008 campaign, you'll recall, who said he was unfit to be president. But he's such a sap, he's such a patsy, he's such a forgiving guy, he doesn't care that they destroyed him. Otherwise, we'd be at the end of, right now, we'd be marking the end of a two-term successful McCain presidency. But he doesn't care, they destroyed him. And he's still sucking up to them, which is kind of pathetic. But everyone went nuts about this, about calling the media the enemy of the American people. And I'm happy, actually, with that designation. I don't object to it, because I think they are. I don't think they fulfill the function of a free press. And McCain, of course, is wrong. Criticizing the press is not the same as suppressing them. They should be criticized. They're not an elite college of cardinals. They're not the dispassionate arbiters. And to pretend that they are is absolutely ridiculous. In American terms, the American papers are among the dullest on the planet. They're certainly the dullest in the English-speaking world. The boring, colorless monodailies thinning out every month as their business model collapses. These are less interesting. I like to read, before I turn in at night, I like to read online the Pakistani papers. They're better written, and they've got more stuff in there that's interesting to read. The American media became a guild, and they destroyed themselves. But it was interesting to me that Trump's tweet was not even honestly reported, even in reporting his attack on them. They didn't get it right. I read this story in Politico. President Donald Trump charged Friday that the media aren't an enemy of the White House, but an adversary of the American people. Ooh! In a since-deleted tweet Friday afternoon, the president blasted what he called, quote, fake news media, singling out in particular the New York Times, CNN, and NBC News. The fake news media, failing New York Times, CNN, NBC News, and many more, is not my enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. Sick, Trump tweeted. The post was deleted shortly afterwards. So if you read the first 3 paragraphs of the Politico story, you'd think that this tweet, the thing you take away from it, is all about a since-deleted tweet. The post was deleted shortly afterward. Delete, delete, delete. Trump had attacked the American media and then realized this was lunatic even for him and had deleted his tweet. You had to read on deep into the Politico story to find out that, in fact, he retweeted it 16 minutes later, exactly the same, the only difference being that he'd added ABC and CBS to the list of fake news institutions. And he's not wrong in that respect. One of the most revolting and pathetic trends in American media these last couple of years has been the rise of the sort of fact-checking column. Previously, if you disagreed with something somebody said, you wrote a column objecting to it. This or that politician says something you don't like, you write a column riposting to it. Now, as part of their pretense that they're a college of cardinals, they're neutral arbiters, they've introduced a whole new genre of fake journalism, the fact-check column, in which half the time they're not checking facts, they're just disagreeing with your opinion and trying to pass it off as a neutral, judiciously weighed fact check. For example, this is from PolitiFact, which is an entire institution devoted to fact-checking. And it's called Fact-Checking President Donald Trump's Florida Rally. And this is the first section. I didn't read on after this because it was such rubbish. Trump takes Jefferson out of context. Trump used the words of President Thomas Jefferson to make the case that the media and newspapers are illegitimate. Quote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper," Trump quoted Jefferson as saying on June 14th, 1807. That quote checks out, but it's not the whole story on Jefferson. Ooh, the quote checks out. We can't nail him on an inaccurate quote, but it's not the whole story on Jefferson. Trump takes Jefferson out of context. Okay, here's the context. Jefferson to John Norval, June 14th, 1807, about the prostitution of the press. Prostitution. My, oh my, that sounds like he's suppressing the free press too, John McCain. Thomas Jefferson, maybe you should pick a fight with him. He's close to your own age. Jefferson to John Norval. It is a melancholy truth that a suppression of the press could not more completely deprive the nation of its benefits than is done by its abandoned prostitution to falsehood. Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. The real extent of this state of misinformation is known only to those who are in situations to confront facts within their knowledge with the lies of the day. The lies of the day. That was Thomas Jefferson's version of fake news. Something to bear in mind on this President's Day. The lies of the day. So it's not just that that quote checked out, it's that the PolitiFact headline, "Trump takes Jefferson out of context," is wrong. The context is clear. He thought the press had prostituted themselves to falsehood, guilty of the lies of the day, and that nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. But PolitiFact says, but it's not the whole story on Jefferson. In 1787, Jefferson wrote to Edward Carrington and presented a seemingly different opinion. The basis of our governments being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right, Jefferson wrote. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. Where's the lack of context here? Jefferson attacked the press in 1807, and Trump quoted it accurately. And 20 years earlier, Jefferson thought something rather different from the press. That makes Trump's point. Respect for the press isn't a permanent fact of life. It depends on the press earning that respect every day. And a fact check which claims that Trump took Jefferson out of context because Jefferson had been more favorably disposed to the press 20 years earlier, doesn't disprove that. So the fact check here is garbage. I wanted to see who wrote the fact check because, you know, let's face it, this reporter might have said something different 20 years earlier. I mean, 20 years earlier, he liked Hootie and the Blowfish and was doing the Macarena. People change. Generally, the views one holds towards the end of one's life are granted greater weight than those one held in the early days. So I went back to the headline, Fact-Checking President Donald Trump's Florida Rally by Alison Graves, Katie Sanders, and Aaron Sharrickman. So it takes 3 reporters to file an inaccurate fact check of an accurate Donald Trump quote. That's why the American media are going out of business. That's not a viable business model when you need 3 third-rate reporters to fake fact check an accurate Trump quote. So I looked up on their website who these fellas are. Aaron Sharrickman isn't just any low-level minimum wage reporter intern. He's the executive director of PolitiFact. He's a 2016 Reynolds Fellow at the University of Missouri and co-teaches on political fact-checking at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Just think of that. This is America. It's not just that we have schools of journalism now, which is one reason why it's become a liberal upper middle class profession, because nobody else can be so lavishly endowed by their parents as to be able to afford to run up $250,000 in college debt to do jobs with declining salaries and ever more layoffs. You've got to have a really good trust fund to be able to go into that. But now, not just any old kind of regular journalism school, you can actually do classes in political fact-checking. And they've got more than one teacher. It says here, Erin Sharrockman co-teaches a class on political fact-checking. That's how serious a field of scholarship it is. They can't just have one teacher, you've got to have two, maybe three, maybe four, I don't know. I couldn't afford to take this class. 2, 3, 4 co-teachers to give you your master's, your PhD in political fact-checking. Second writer, Katie Sanders. She's not just a low-level intern either. She's the deputy editor of PolitiFact. Don't know whether she's credentialed in political fact-checking. Don't know whether she's got a master's in it or just a bachelor's degree in political fact-checking. And then the third reporter, Alison Graves, is a reporter with PolitiFact. Previously, she reported for PolitiFact Missouri, which, as you recall, is the state in which Erin Sharrockman co-teaches his class on political fact-checking. So she may be credentialed in political fact-checking. Anyway, I then scrolled down the page and saw that Alison Graves does these truthometer statements as part of the fact-checking thing. And she had rated this statement by Donald Trump as false. Look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden, who would believe this? Said Trump. Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible. And Alison Graves, fact-checking this statement as false, wrote, defending his immigrant travel ban at a February 18th campaign rally, President Donald Trump referred to several places that have taken in a large number of refugees and have recently been attacked. Trump mentioned well-documented terrorist attacks in Europe alongside an apparently sinister occurrence we had not heard about in Sweden. We've got to keep our country safe. You look at what's happening. We've got to keep our country safe. You look at what's happening in Germany. You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden, who would believe this? Sweden, they took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible. You look at what's happening in Brussels. You look at what's happening all over the world. Take a look at Nice. Take a look at Paris. And Alison Graves precisely wrote, Sweden has let in a large number of immigrants and refugees, but we couldn't find any evidence that indicates Sweden's immigration policy is causing the types of problems with terrorist incidents that Trump suggested, and couldn't find any record of an attack by terrorists or immigrants in Sweden on the night of February 17th, or any night recently. This is why he's right to call you the enemy of the American people. He wasn't talking about terrorist attacks. He was talking about what's happening in Germany, what's happening in Sweden. And I suspect Alison Graves and her colleagues actually know what's happening in Sweden and Germany, but they don't want you to hear about it. What's happened is that Sweden and Germany let in the most so-called refugees in hard numbers, 1.5 million refugees. Sweden let in the most per capita. How many per capita? Every day last year, an average of 90 unaccompanied boys entered Sweden and only 8 girls in these refugees. So there were 90 guys for every 8 gals. And as a result, Swedish adolescents now have one of the worst sex imbalances of any population cohort ever recorded. You're familiar with China and its ruthlessly enforced one-child policy, where the government said told parents they could only have 1 kid. So as a result, an entire generation of Chinese parents aborted all the girls or killed them outside the womb. And as a result, they now have a sex imbalance in that generation of 119 boys for every 100 girls. Sweden has caught up with that in the space of 2 years, simply by being the second most welcoming country of so-called refugees. It now has 123 16 and 17-year-old boys for every 100 16 and 17-year-old girls. 123 boys for every 100 girls. And around the planet, a surplus population of young males always means more crime, more violence, always. As we see in Sweden, and as Donald Trump knows, and as Alison Graves and PolitiFact and the Associated Press are pretending they don't know. They have no idea what he's referring to. He's talking about an airport being blown up. He's talking about a truck attack. And we couldn't find any evidence of any of those in Sweden. No, he's not. He's talking about, quote, what's happening in Sweden. And what's happening in Sweden is that the refugee policies have been disastrous for Swedish women. In Sweden, in Scandinavia, in Germany, they have a tradition of public bathing for over a century. Mixed public bathing in municipal swimming baths. It's not something Americans, Canadians easily relate to. It's a very particular Northern European tradition. Or it was, until these refugees started showing up, and female patrons of public swimming baths are now routinely assaulted. So that in January, Sweden's national swimming arena was forced for the very first time in history to segregate men and women in the hot tubs last January last year. So goodbye to a century-old tradition, because refugee rights, migrant rights, trump your culture. Have a look at this photograph here. This is me with a young lady called Anne Sophie. And I met with her over the summer, last summer. And she and her daughters and her niece were sexually assaulted by a group of refugees in the public swimming bath at Östersund, which is a town up there in the middle of Sweden. And I went to those public baths in Östersund just to see for myself. The Swedes are very hygienic people, for example. Most people know that. It's a very clean, well-ordered society. It isn't so clean, well-ordered anymore. You're meant to take a shower before you enter the swimming baths. So when you go in, there's a lot of Swedish men all standing around, soaping the old wedding tackle and having a full shower before you get into the bath. So I joined them. While I was there, I watched 3 so-called refugees come out in their underwear and get into the baths, which is why they've now got amazingly high levels of ammonia being detected in those swimming baths. But as I said, I had a long conversation with Anne Sophie about the sexual assault on her young daughters and niece and on herself. I was at Karlstad in Sweden, arrived the morning after a music festival at which dozens of young women had been sexually assaulted, and in which the response of the Swedish state was to say, was to issue little bracelets saying with no in Arabic on it to tell the guys not to sexually assault them. Östersund, Earth Hour. We all like Earth Hour because you switch the lights off to save the environment. It's a big environmental tradition. In Östersund, Earth Hour was cancelled because it's no longer safe to turn the lights out. The mayor advised ladies not to go out unaccompanied. I was at Lid shopping and I was having my hair cut. And I noticed that a young lady in the hair salon was having her beautiful blonde hair dyed dark. And I wondered why that was. And my hairdresser said to me that more and more Swedish ladies are coming in to have their blonde hair dyed dark because the blondes attract the attention of these excitable young men, these so-called refugees. I was in the town of Stora, I went to visit a refugee house and stood in the bathroom where a particularly bloody murder had been committed. And I, in fact, attended the murder trial of this illiterate refugee who had to be represented by, had to have a translator there at the expense of Swedish taxpayers to explain everything that was going on. What was interesting to me was that it was the high water point of Swedish feminism. It was a panel of judges, most of whom were female. The attorneys were female. The advisors from the Swedish prosecution service were female. Even the translator was female. But that is the high water point of Swedish feminism. They were dealing, all this brilliant female talent was there in the service of an illiterate, snarling man who could not speak the language. Yet, judging from the photographs, I mentioned I was in that bathroom. The bathroom where he committed the murder had been cleaned up. When I saw it, when it was displayed in court, it was soaked in blood everywhere. They now have a level of crime that they have never known in Sweden. They now have a level of sexual assault that they have never known in Sweden. They now have a level of rape that they have never known in Sweden. When I talked about this in a debate in Toronto last year, I was debating Louise Arbour, who was the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and prosecuted war crimes in Sudan and Bosnia. Actually, back then she was a serious feminist and took rape seriously as a war crime. And I was also up against Simon Sharma, the distinguished BBC television historian. And I made some of these points about the novel kinds of crime that previously ordered, civilized European societies had never had to deal with. Gang rape in public places. And I was appearing with Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader who pulled off Brexit a couple of months later. And we brought up the astonishing vulnerability of German and Scandinavian women in particular, thanks to the admission of these refugees. And what was fascinating to me was that Louise Arbour, who'd previously prosecuted rape as a war crime, played rape for laughs and got big laughs. Look at this.
Let me just address very briefly, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to return to that, to the issues raised by these newborn feminists there. And I see the clock running, so I reserve my right to flesh out these ideas a little more deeply, but I can assure you that for those of us feminists who came, certainly the women of my generation, from a cultural, political environment in this country in which religion dictated most of our rights and privileges, we've managed to start occupying our place in public life, not by pushing and trying to exclude others, and certainly not by espousing as champions people who have that kind of ideology.
Thank you. Okay. I want to hear from the pro team back-to-back. So, Simon, let's have your rebuttal, and then I'll come on to Mark and Nigel.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just struck by how obsessed with sex these two guys are, really, actually. It's a bit sad, really, actually.
Simon Sharma, a bit sad, really. That's pretty funny, Simon. Simon returned to his point just at the end of his presentation about how these guys aren't rapists, no need to worry about the rape.
And all of those men arriving weren't arriving with the purpose of upping their rape score either.
Simon, we're going to have lots of time in the cross-examination to get into these issues, but I want to come over to the other side, and Mark Steyn, get your quick reaction to what you've heard.
Hey, I made a decision tonight that I wasn't going to do funny stuff. I was going to be deadly serious, and I'm slightly amazed at our colleagues' ability to get big laughs on gang rape. Madame Arbor scoffs at the newfound feminists over here. I'm not much of a feminist, but I draw the line at the 3-year-old getting raped and the 7-year-old getting gang raped in a basement. And when Simon tells us that, funnily enough, we're all obsessed, maybe we don't get enough action in the Toronto singles bars. Madame Arbor, as she said, is a feminist of a certain generation. And those feminists were very clear, as Madame Arbor was very clear in Sudan, that rape is not about sex, whatever Simon may say. Rape is about power, which is what Madame Arbor says. And we're not talking about the kind of sex I want to have. I ain't into 3-year-old girls. But the 14-year-old girl in Sudan, here's a random example from 10 days of German migrant crimes in January. 16-year-old boy raped inside Wolfsburg City Hall. 13-year-old girl sexually assaulted near a railway station in Ellwagen. 3 girls sexually assaulted at a swimming pool in Ansbach. 15-year-old girl raped at a railway station in Wuppertal. Attempted gang rape of a 13-year-old girl in Gelsenkirchen. I can go on and on. These are all rapes, gang rapes in public places, trains, streets, parks, and even City Hall. And I congratulate you on getting big laughs with that, Simon, and you, Louise, because if I'd known that, I'd be doing open night mic on gang rape at a comedy club. It isn't funny. It isn't funny.
I make no claims to be a great debater, but that's the point at which an audience of Toronto liberals realized the truth about what is going on in Europe. And that turned the debate for Nigel Farage and me. That moment. And it's an important moment. And it goes back to what Alison Graves and PolitiFact and the Associated Press are talking about with Donald Trump. And his so-called false statement about Sweden. There's a great story going on in Sweden right now. It's a story about the contradictions of multiculturalism. It's a story about whether feminism can exist when you have mass migration from cultures where women are property. And on the evidence of what's going on in Scandinavia and Germany, and I spent most of last summer there, all of last summer there, spent much of last year there talking to dozens and dozens of Swedish women who have been the victims of sexual assault, who are scared to go out unaccompanied, who are fed up of being told by their police chiefs that you have to wear some stupid bracelet that asks refugees not to rape you, and that the stupid bracelet is going to keep you safe. The stories the American media never tell, because in essence, that is the job they do now. Their principal function in the modern world is to decide what you don't need to know. This is the biggest story of our time. The demographic transformation of some of the oldest societies on earth is the biggest story of our time. And little snippy, dweeby, credential fact checkers from the University of Missouri School of Journalism don't want you to know this. And their job is to decide what it is you don't need to know. And that's why Donald Trump is right to call them the enemy of the people. And that's why Thomas Jefferson was right. This is not the function of a free press in a healthy society. We'll see you next time.